guys.
Why did you choose PowerShift as your first public event since the baby was born? Come on, I'm on it. I just asked you a question. Answer the question.
That's a great question. They were incredibly persistent. It was no, this event is really connected to the book that I'm writing now, and the film that actually Abby's working on to go with the book, which it really is about how we can't solve the climate crisis without engaging in a very deep critique of capitalism, and that really, it's an economic transformation that will allow us to get at the root causes of the climate crisis. And when I saw that this PowerShift conference was really framing its arguments in those terms, I thought it would be crazy not to be here and be part of it and learn from people and go to as many sessions as I could, so that's why I'm here.
Everyone's agrees.
That was a one sneeze answer.
As many folks can raise their hands, and I'll point to you if you have questions.
Hey, Mark. Mark from CKUT. Now it's CKCU, Carlton. Mark Brooks. Met you at Keystone XL in Washington. I'm sure you remember. Thousands of people that you met there. So Naomi, great that you could come. And my question is about, I guess it's kind of what you're working on with the new book, so I've heard. The way forward. So a lot of what we've been trying has not been working in terms of solving the climate crisis. And it seems to me that you're drawing parallels between how this can become a real economic issue, and we can involve groups that perhaps have not typically been allies before. You know, perhaps labor unions versus environmentalists and so on. Is that the way you think that we're going to be able to solve this problem, if at all? Or is it going to take a more fundamental transformation of our economic system, a real change in how our economy works?
Well, I think both, because fundamentally, the climate change is not in itself the crisis. It's a symptom of a broader crisis that has to do with an economic model that's built on endless growth, and the idea that we can act as if we can have infinite consumption on a finite planet. So the issue is consumption, and an economic model that needs endless and expansive consumption in order to survive. And you know, for me, I feel like that's what I've always been writing about. I mean, this is, you know, my first book, No Logo, was about the culture of consumption and the creation of needs that were not needs, that were, and the exploitation behind that. And I started to notice a few years back that a lot of the real solutions to climate change involve things that we on the left have been fighting for all along. I mean, if you look at trade and the movements that focused on corporate globalization, because of the exploitation of labor at home and abroad, because of the environmental consequences, obviously there's also a huge climate consequence to a trade model that acts as if distance doesn't matter, and it's the most emission-heavy way you could imagine to plan an economy, and it wages a war on local economies. So, and we've also been fighting for many years to protect the public sphere on its own merits, because we need it. But in the context of climate change, what you see is that you need a very strong public sphere, a very strong commons, to deal with the effects of climate change that we can't avoid, because what you see is that if you have weak infrastructure and you get hit, you know, with a heavy storm, you're toast. But also that if you want to avert the climate chaos, if you want to actually lower your emissions, you also need public infrastructure, you need public transit, you need this strong bones of the public sphere. So what I'm trying to do is, I'm not trying to invent a movement from scratch. What I'm trying to say is, actually, the movements that we've been building all along are the movements that we need to marshal in it together to meet this challenge. And I think that there's been a strange phenomenon. There's been a lot of talk here about silos, and environmentalism has siloed itself, and it's also been sort of left to its own devices by a broader left movement in large part. I think because environmentalism is always perceived as being very well funded. It's sort of like, oh, well, those professional green groups sort of have the climate thing covered. We're certainly talking a lot about it and doing a lot of education and so on. But I think, particularly in the US, but also in Canada, you know, the environmental movement is very heavily shaped by where its funding comes from. It's funded by large foundations. And those foundations are not interested in a systemic critique. So you have these kind of two solitudes where the green groups really are afraid of a systemic critique, of really talking about these bigger issues because it will threaten their funding. I mean, this is not true of every single one, but it's definitely the broad trend. And then you have the broader left thinking, okay, this is one issue we don't have to worry about. You know, we've got so much on our plates already, we'll just sort of let the professionals deal with the climate thing. And I think we, on the left, have given up one of the, in my opinion, the most compelling argument against this economic model, which is that it is at war with the life support systems on Earth.
I want to ask about, you say that this is, you know, we have to engage in a critique of capitalism, but to do that we need to kind of, the media, and to get this kind of message out, and at a time when the sort of media is largely privatized and collapsing, but that, you know, the role of gagging played in dictatorships has now been replaced by like astroturfing, PR, and all sorts of lobbyist groups kind of drowning out any kind of message, and combined with the fact that even science, as you said, is kind of privatized. Those who have the money to fund certain studies their message gets to be prioritized. What do you think we need to, like, where do you think this kind of collapse of the media is opening up a space for journalists to cover differently, and where do you think this is actually disastrous in terms of getting the message across in order to be able to, you know, cover what's happening and move people?
Well, I mean, my experience is eventually, you know, you don't tailor movements to media. You build movements that become so large the media can't ignore them. And movements are always going to be misrepresented in infuriating ways by the mainstream media. You know, that's just kind of part of being an activist, you know, complaining about the way but that said, when movements get large enough, they can no longer be ignored. And we saw this around Occupy. You know, we saw that in the sort of Occupy Wall Street moment, that that suddenly you were getting, you know, there were a lot of articles about inequality, but even, you know, digging deeply into the failures of capitalism in places like the Financial Times and The Economist. You know, I'm somebody who's always tried to sort of work in both worlds. You know, I write for alternative publications, but I also, you know, bang my head up against the wall and try to, you know, get my voice heard in the mainstream. And you know, it's not monolithic. But like I said, I don't think that sort of focusing on, you know, how do we do this? How do we get the media to make our arguments for us? I don't think that's a winning strategy. I think the winning strategy is you build your movement, make it so big that it can't be ignored. And I think we saw that with Quebec too. Eventually they will come to you because you are news. And beyond that, I mean, obviously all the usual things about new media and social media, and, you know, the extent to which we are less reliant on corporate media to carry our messages. And that, I think, is really exciting, that you can, it's a lot easier than it used to be for us to tell each other about what we're doing and to build that movement that eventually will break through to a corporate media that, as you said, is itself in crisis, facing a crisis of legitimacy and financial crisis.